For our COBT friends, it's Maynard, Mike, and Todd here with something that is absolutely fantastic. We're going to get to visit today with Walter Isaacson. So many of you know Walter. He's definitely the person who doesn't need an introduction. But you'll remember he is an acclaimed biographer. He's recently written a book on Elon Musk. The three of us have had the opportunity to read it. We can't wait to talk to Walter about the book. He's written about many other famous people. And before he got into all this great writing, he was the editor at Time Magazine. He was chairman and CEO at CNN. He was CEO of the Aspen Institute. He's a senior advisor at Perella Weinberg. But more than anything, he's a good friend. And Walter, we're just delighted to have you and to get to be able to visit with you about the book.
It's wonderful to be back with you again, Maynard.
Well, we thinking about how to jump in on this, Walter. I know you've been talking about a book in public now for a while. I guess one of the things we were struck by as we read it is, obviously what an incredible person, and history was happening as you were writing the book. Tell us a little bit about the experience, how long it took, when it started, just a little bit of the background before you kicked off this latest project.
Yeah, about 3 years ago, I had done books about people who helped usher in revolutions in our time. I did Steve Jobs, who helped usher in the digital personal computer revolution, and then Jennifer Doudna and her team who created CRISPR, the gene editing tool, helped to usher in what will be a revolution in life sciences. And so for my next book, I thought, well, I should do Elon Musk. He's bringing us back into the era of space travel, but he's also helped moving us to the era of electric vehicles, solar power, batteries, and energy transition that you know so much about, Maynard. And so I talked to him on the phone. We talked for about almost 2 hours. And I said, well, the one thing I want is I don't want to do this book based on 5 or 10 interviews or 15 interviews even. I want to be by your side for 2 years, whenever I want, whatever meeting, just travel around with you, just sit in the corner, take notes, watch, walk the factory line, be at the rocket line. He said, sure. It surprised me. But then I said, but by the way, you'll have no control over the book. I don't even want to send it to you in advance. And he said, sure. And then just as I told my wife and friends, all of a sudden one of them said, hey, Elon just tweeted out that Walter is writing my biography. So that's how I got on that roller coaster. It was, totally interesting because I love, as you know, engineering and science and the notion of artificial intelligence, which he was in the forefront of, as well as energy transition and rockets. But then he bought Twitter, so it made it a more complex book, especially since he's got a wonderful feel for engineering, but not for social interactions. And so I think he's had a tougher time turning Twitter into what he wants.
So, Walter, the book really was fabulous. The three of us had such a great time reading it and comparing notes as we were going through it. And there's so many different pieces of it. I think, to your point there, it absolutely comes across that you had complete access, to his family. He had a tough relationship with his dad. You talked to the dad with ex-wives. It's with people who left the company, who were fired. I mean, you really, I think it comes across as there was just no editing by Elon, right? Like it's completely genuine in terms of.
He's a very transparent person. He's very transparent. Yes. And I was surprised, but he wanted me to see the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I think that's important because in this day and age, we either try to make somebody a saint or a sinner, or canonize or demonize them. And this is a guy you got to see in full. And boy, he's the most impactful, interesting dude around these days.
How would this compare this book writing process to, for instance, some of the other books like the Steve Jobs book or some other big personalities that you've written about? How would this process compare to those?
Well, I've written about 3 controversial personalities in my time, current ones, Henry Kissinger, then Steve Jobs, then Elon Musk. Some of my others, like Ben Franklin or Jennifer Doudna, have been less controversial. And so you really did have to navigate not only the extraordinary achievements a person did, but why that person engenders, so much anger at times. And with Musk, it was pretty easy. He runs roughshod over people. So did Steve Jobs. But everything about Musk seemed to me one order of magnitude greater than it was with Steve. In other words, Musk's intensity for engineering and his fingertip feel for material science, or his all-in hardcore way of dealing with people, which sometimes wasn't a pretty sight. But what I try to do, and I have above my desk here in New Orleans, a little card that says, let me tell you a story. I try, as you've seen in the book, to make it feel like you're alongside Elon Musk. It moves at a very fast pace because each day he does 20 or 30 things and focuses intensely on them. So I wanted to tell you the story of the people he dealt with, the stories of him walking the assembly line, how he fixed something, how he fired somebody, so that you can make your own judgments about him instead of me trying to preach at you like a lot of authors try to do.
No, that's exactly the experience the reader has. I guess as a reader, you're almost the intensity of the book because of the intensity of his life. You really feel that. I'm assuming being with him, around him, talking to him for 2 years, like your life, you probably felt like a lightning rod. You were catching his energy. What was just the experience like for you to do this?
Well, it was particularly interesting to be with him at the odd hours of the day, like late on a Friday night when he was down in the southern tip of Texas in Boca Chica near Brownsville, where he has the launch pad for Starship, this huge rocket that he may try to shoot off again in a month or so, biggest movable object ever made by humans. And on a Friday night, the moon is rising, and there are only 2 or 3 people working on the launch pad because they have no launches scheduled. And suddenly you can see him go into what Grimes, his girlfriend, calls demon mode, in which it gets dark and intense. And so it's really being rough on the person in charge of the launch pad, saying, why aren't there dozens of people working? We'll never get to Mars. We'll never get humanity to Mars if we don't have an all-in sense of urgency. And the guy kind of said, well, it's a Friday night and we don't have a launch scheduled. And he ordered up a surge. And that's what you'll see throughout the book. Whenever he feels that people don't have a sense of urgency, it's almost like he pulls a fire alarm and there's a surge. They had to get 200 people to South Texas, by that weekend, so that they could work around the clock on stacking the Starship rocket. Came in from Cape Canaveral in Los Angeles, people sleeping on the floor. And we're just there all night at the launch pad, at the factory line, building the Raptor and building the boosters in South Texas with that intensity. And that's why, in some ways, he drives people mad. He drives people to distraction, but he also drives them to do what they didn't think they would be able to do. It's why he's the only one who's been able to get astronauts from the U.S. into orbit, into the space station. Whereas Boeing, who got a contract to do it at the same time SpaceX did, still hasn't been able to launch a test rocket. NASA can no longer get people to the space station because it grounded the shuttle. This intensity, and I try to show it because if you're a manager of an enterprise, you need to know how this works.
As we were comparing notes and thinking about it, I think there's one way to observe his behavior, which is to think about, other CEOs, other business endeavors, and then you can come to the conclusion that Musk is particularly harsh. But if you think of it as compare him to, General Patton or someone with a mission that is larger than just a corporate endeavor, if you see him in that light, then you don't think he's harsh. You just realize the mission is so important that, of course, you fire people when the stakes are that high, and of course, you're demanding. What's the right way to see him, or are those kind of false choices?
I think you're totally right to say he's mission driven. As a young kid growing up in South Africa. He didn't have any friends. He was scrawny, socially awkward. And he'd sit in the corner of the bookstore and read the comics, the superhero comics, and he'd read the science fiction. And he said, the heroes in the comic books were trying to save the world, and they wore their underpants on the outside and they looked ridiculous, but at least they were trying to save the world. And so as a young kid, he comes up with, what are my 3 missions for humanity? 1, make us multiplanetary. In other words, get humanity to Mars. 2nd, make sustainable energy on this planet. 3rd, from reading Isaac Asimov's robot stories, make sure that artificial intelligence is a benefit, not a harm to humanity. And at first I thought when he was talking about these 3 missions, it was just the type of pontificating you would do at a pep rally for your team. But late at night, I just hear him tell himself, we've got to get humanity to Mars. We got to get 1 million electric vehicles made. And so I think he had that mission-driven intensity. And what he said to me is that people, including myself, who have a whole lot of empathy and really, really care that the people around them are happy, sometimes are selfish because they want to make sure the people around them like them. And so they won't be tough on people. And that may make everybody feel good, but it hurts the overall mission. And it hurts thousands of people who aren't sitting in front of you, who depend on you being able to execute on the mission.
So I thought one thing, and this comes up quite a lot in the quote energy transition, Walter, which is the difference between soft tech and hard tech. And so much of today's technology world is around quote soft tech, and very, very few people, a lot of people shy away from hard tech because it's very hard. And there's an analogy or a discussion that you have in the book where you say, Steve Jobs, these guys were pretty similar, but Steve really didn't want to walk the factory floor. And for some reason, probably because of his interest, but Elon is a tech person who walked the factory floor, who loved the engineering and the materials and the hard tech. Do you want to just talk about that? Because his achievements in that sense are even more pronounced because they're more difficult.
You have to realize he's making real products, physical things, and the toughest products in the world to make, meaning rocket ships that'll get into orbit, or automobiles that can have a very long range and do it on lithium-ion batteries. And he says that designing those products is hard, but the truly important thing is what he calls the machine that builds the machine. In other words, designing the factories, designing the assembly lines that'll be able not only to produce a Tesla, but produce 1 million Teslas at scale and at a low cost. And America has gotten away from making its own products sometimes. Somebody like a Steve Jobs will design a beautiful iPhone and then almost throw it over the wall to someplace in China to have it be made, and Steve never visited the factories in China. Musk makes his designers have their desk on the assembly line, facing the assembly line, so that they can watch every hour what it takes to manufacture whatever it was they designed. And it means that they iterate, they innovate on a daily basis. So to fix little things, design it in a better way with manufacturing in mind. People didn't think you could build the world's biggest car factories in the United States, but he did it both in California and in Texas. And I think that's one of the inspiring things about him in this book, which is this notion that we can actually build things in this country again. And by doing so, we can design better things. We can iterate our designs faster.
The book also, it's particularly in the early days, but really throughout the book. But when you talk about his time at X.com and PayPal, the book gives you an introduction to kind of the Silicon Valley, a lot of the big players, a lot of the mentality, a lot of the venture capital groups. It's really quite a dose of seeing what life was like, particularly when he was coming of age. Do you mind talking about that culture and that community a little bit and some of your takeaways from that experience?
Yeah, there's a culture in Silicon Valley that's hardcore, all in, hackathon culture. And whether it's Bill Gates in the early days of Microsoft or Bezos in the early days of Amazon, you see that hardcore, all in mentality. And that's the way that Musk was when he does his first companies, Zip2 and then X.com, both in Silicon Valley. You know, he sleeps on the office floor at night. He expects everybody to work. And then at 4 a.m., after they've worked late into the night, they play hard charging video games for another hour and yell and scream and do that. You know, but we have two cultures at the extreme in some of our workplaces. The other extreme was the culture he found when he first went to Twitter headquarters after getting a deal to buy it. And I remember being with him, and they said, oh, we're a very nurturing, quiet place here. We allow people to work from home. We have yoga studios so you can get your mind right when you come in. And we care about your psychological safety. And Musk looked at me and he kind of gave a raspy laugh. And he said, psychological safety? That's our enemy. We want people to feel threatened. We want them to feel hardcore. We want them to feel intense. And within a week, 2 weeks, he had gotten rid of 80% of the people there and changed it radically from being a nurturing, sort of a friendly, work-life balance, psychologically nurturing place to being a hardcore, all intense place. I say that because neither approach is right or wrong. I've worked at places like the Old Time magazine that were sweet and nurturing and kind, and I've worked at hardcore, intense places. Anybody who's a leader of an enterprise has to know, how do you combine those two and how do you balance those two in order to get the best out of your workers and also get the best workers to come to you. A lot of people don't want to work for Musk. It's pretty intense. But I told you about that time I went to the launch pad and he reamed out the guy who was doing the launch pad because he wasn't intense enough. A guy named Andy Krabs. His picture's in the book. Well, I always follow up on these people. And Andy Krabs learned how to deal with them, but finally left. It was too intense. And then I was in Los Angeles a week ago on giving a book talk, and I see somebody coming up afterwards, and it was Andy Krabs. I said, "What's up?" He said, "Well, I left SpaceX, as you know, and because I was feeling burned out, but now I'm working somewhere else and I'm feeling bored, so I'm going to go back to SpaceX. I'd rather be burned out than be bored." Some people thrive in these environments, some don't. And the book, I think, should help you sort out in your own mind, if you're running an enterprise, how's the best way for me to do it and for my people.
Well, it sort of comes across too that maybe like playing pro sports or going in the army, like you can do it for a while, but then you know, maybe you can't keep up.
You can do it in your 20s and 30s. Although there are people, Gwen Shotwell at SpaceX, Mark Juncosa at SpaceX, some people like at Tesla, including Drew Baglino, Lars Moravy, and others, have been there for 15, 20 years. Once you learn how to deal with Musk, it's a ride you don't want to get off of.
She was certainly an interesting character, Shotwell, who's been with him really since I think the early days of SpaceX, and manages to ride the ups and downs and to occasionally grab him and say, no, we can't do that. And did you find her to be one of the more interesting characters in the book, although there were so many?
Yeah, I mean, I spend a lot of time drilling down on the people who also run these enterprises and also help run Elon Musk. Because as you know so well, and I've worked with you for years, it's not just about being a great leader, it's about the team of people you build around you. I asked Jobs what was the greatest product he had created. I thought he'd say the iPod or the iPhone or the Mac. He said, no, it was a team that built those things, because making a team is hard. So whether it's Elon Musk just meeting Linda Yaccarino for the first time, who ran ad sales at NBC Universal, and hiring her to be the CEO of Twitter, now known as X, or it's Gwen Shotwell, he knows how to fill in the places where he's not good, which especially is dealing with people. And Gwen knows how to deal with the people who work at SpaceX, but she also knows how to deal with Elon Musk. And I think that's an important trait, not just somebody like a Gwen Shotwell, but a trait that Musk has, which is how do I make up for some of my shortcomings?
And Walter, I thought one of the interesting things, well, kind of give you an introduction to what I do. I do market sentiment, market analysis. And so we're watching investors on a daily basis. And one of the things that your book did for me is to kind of fill some holes in, and it goes back to what's going on right now with Tesla. It's like they keep lowering prices, and all these analysts and investors are going, why are you keep doing this? And his whole point is like, I'm doing it because, people have to afford these cars. We have to, decarbonize, this business. And it really kind of, your book kind of really fills in why he's doing what he's doing. He's not doing it for market share. He's doing it because he wants to get as many vehicles out as possible. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, I mean, and you watch Bezos do that with Amazon in the old days. At one point, they asked Jeff, do you even know how to spell the word profit? And he said, yeah, Prophet. And, he felt that he had to be a visionary, not just a short-term return on investment guy. But Musk looks at costs really strongly. He's got a low-cost car he's about to introduce. He sees the headwinds we have when interest rates get so high. And so I think he's feeling a little bit of a headwind on auto sales, EV sales, and Tesla sales. Question is whether he should advertise more. He doesn't feel that's right. He'd rather it be cheaper to the consumer. The other thing he feels, which may or may not turn out to be true, but he always seems to turn the impossible into the merely late, which is when self-driving software ends up really working and you can have fully self-driving cars. All of these Teslas have the hardware for that, and people will then be paying a monthly subscription charge to have FSD 12 or whichever version it is that finally works very well. So he thinks by selling more cars now, even at a lower price, he will have people subscribing to his services, because Tesla is not just a physical, car. It's also a software, and that software gets updated on an almost weekly basis.
I think the other thing that also comes across in quarterly calls is he continues to say that I'm very cautious because I was scarred by 2009, 2008, they almost went bankrupt. Maybe talk about that, that time in his life and how it really affects all the decisions, because same thing happened at SpaceX, same things happen in some of these other businesses. Maybe kind of talk about how that scarred him and how it's really kind of influenced the way he looks at business and how he's really driven.
Well, he's got an apocalyptic mindset ever since he was a kid in South Africa. It's like, the world could be coming to an end at any moment. And certainly at the end of 2008, that December, he had run out of money both at SpaceX and at Tesla. And he was borrowing money from his brother, his girlfriend, his, everybody else, and writing personal checks to get the pay done. Because SpaceX had launched 3 rockets, all of which had exploded, and they had only budgeted for 3. And he said, no, even if it's my last penny, I'm going to get a rocket into orbit. And secondly, Tesla had just gone totally out of money because it wasn't mass producing the cars yet. And facing that bankruptcy, he just worked around the clock at both places with an intensity and refused to choose, as both people at both enterprises said, choose one of us. You're not going to have both survive. He says, like having 2 kids. You're not going to say, I can't feed them both, so I'll let one starve. Well, at the end of 2008, finally a rocket goes up. He's successful there. And Chrysler and others make some deals with Tesla, and they get Tesla churning out cars again. But just like my parents who grew up in the Depression, it kind of scars you a bit. You're scared of debt. You're scared of the headwinds that can come from a bad economy. And he also believes, I think unfortunately correctly, that we're in pretty perilous times, both politically at home and geopolitically around the world, whether it's Ukraine or the Middle East or our relationships with China. So he's hunkering down, trying to make sure people can afford his cars. And I'm not sure it's making Wall Street thrilled. The stock's gone down quite a bit in the past month, especially since his last earnings call, when he told people, hey, these are the headwinds we're facing and this is what we're going to do. But Tesla is about to come out with its really low price global car. We'll see if the Cybertruck works. But I think there's a big upside now, too.
Hey, Walter, one of the things that struck me reading the book is that I think people know more about Tesla because it's a public company. It's been in the news, EVs are just more part of our daily life than SpaceX. I know I didn't know much about the evolution of that company. Maybe talk a little bit about the comparison between the two, because we've heard of entrepreneurs creating a new product and building a company. But what he's done with SpaceX is pretty unique. This is something that was really just the domain of the government and these big entities that were not public companies or privately owned. They were behind sort of the government doing this, that, or the other. Talk about the difference and how SpaceX has evolved a little bit, because it's a fascinating story relative.
There's a couple of big things. There's a couple of big ideas you got to keep in mind with SpaceX. One was that it was mission driven. Just one day when he had sold his first two companies, trying to figure out what to do, he said, I want to figure out what America's plan is to getting to Mars. Now, we had gotten to the moon 50 years ago, but then quit going. And we'd had the space shuttle, but we were getting rid of it. We weren't even getting people to orbit. And he realized that NASA and the US didn't have any plans to go to Mars. So he said, well, I'm going to do it. And he started building his own rocket. Now, this is not a recipe for making money, to decide you want to build rockets that go to Mars. But what he brilliantly does is that once he has a mission, he backfills with the business plan to say, okay, how am I going to fund it? And the way he backfilled, the way he figured out a funding mechanism was, well, of course, we'll launch satellites, commercial satellites. We'll do it from Malaysia. That was one of his first customers. We'll do it for others. And then eventually the US became a big customer. In fact, the main big intelligence satellites that the US launches, nobody else can do it. Boeing can't get them up there. NASA can't get it up. Only SpaceX can get them into high Earth orbit the way it needs to. And then he did something that, because this is a sophisticated listening group, I think it's important, but it's not the sexiest thing in the book. Boeing and other contractors got cost plus contracts, something we've done ever since World War II. In other words, if NASA wanted to get astronauts into orbit to the space station, NASA would decide exactly what it would want to build. It would design the rocket. It would make all the specifications. And then it would give a contract to one of the bloated old contractors like Boeing or Northrop Grumman and say, not just here, you got to do it at this price. They'd say, here's all the specifications and you'll get a cost plus contract. Whatever it costs to build it, we'll pay. And plus, we'll give you a profit. And that gave Boeing and other contractors, this was, I think, because they didn't want people profiteering during World War II, but it just meant that if you had cost overruns, you made more money. If you had delays, you made more money. So they give a contract for Boeing to build something to go to the space station, same time they give it to SpaceX. But Elon Musk and Gwen Shotwell say, but it's a different deal for us. We'll finance it. We'll design it. And you give us a fixed price for a mission. For example, getting cargo to the space station. That's a mission. And you tell us what, we will bid on it at a fixed price. And then if we can do it cheaper, we're going to make a lot more money. And if we do it more expensively, we're going to lose money. And we're going to put our own money at risk. Well, SpaceX ends up doing it at 1/10 the cost of Boeing. I say that, but in some ways, Boeing's not gotten an astronaut to the space station. Musk has not only done it, but he's landed his rockets upright and reused them, something Boeing can't do, Amazon can't do, NASA can't do, Russia can't do, China can't do. So it was a new way of doing business. This put your own money at risk instead of cost plus contract. and a new mindset, which is I've got a great mission. I'm going to backfill with a business plan. And once he's got it, he put up almost 5,000 communication satellites of his own. And he's recreated the internet in outer space. And that's something that's $1 trillion a year business, communications and the internet. And now, even here in New Orleans, people got Starlink dishes. You can get the internet from Elon Musk's SpaceX. And that, if you can take 10% of that, that's twice or more than twice the budget of NASA each year. If you can just get 10% of that internet access business. And cruise lines are doing it. Airlines are starting to do it. People who live in Houston and New Orleans where there are hurricanes, people don't like their cable companies. They're starting to just get the Starlink dishes.
It's fascinating. And I'm glad you brought up Starlink, because what happened with Starlink in Ukraine is a great example of his sort of rush to make things happen. But then it also hits kind of his idealism. You know, what will he do and what will he not do? I thought that was a real fascinating.
It's an amazing story. It really is.
Yeah.
I mean, when Russia invades Ukraine back in March or April, the first thing Russia did is it knocked out the communications capacity of the Ukrainian military. And Viasat, which is a commercial satellite company, they got knocked out right away. So did all the military satellites. Only satellites that Russia couldn't knock out were Starlink. So there were urgent messages that came from, Fedorov and Fedorenko and the other Ukrainians saying, you got to save us, because Ukraine would have been crushed in a day or two by Russian troops if they couldn't communicate, if the Ukrainian troops couldn't communicate, know each other's location. And Musk plays superhero. He rushes in free 100, then thousands of Starlink services. But flash forward then to September, I'd been with him for a while. I was back home in New Orleans at my old high school watching a football game, and boom, I'm getting messages from Musk that Ukraine's now trying to use Starlink to do a sneak attack on Russia's fleet in Crimea. And as I said, Musk is very apocalyptic, and he's saying this is going to cause World War III. They're going to retaliate with tactical nukes. He says, why am I even in this war? I made Starlink so people could watch Netflix and chill and play video games. And so he decides to not enable. They had geofenced Crimean coast, which the Ukrainians didn't know. And Musk decides that night, I'm not going to enable this attack. It's going to fail. And that shows he has too much power. And even I said to him, have you talked to General Mark Milley or Jake Sullivan? And he did talk to them. And eventually he realizes he has too much power. He gives control over a certain set of Starlink services. He sells it to the U.S. military. So now you're seeing attacks on Crimea, but it's not Musk that gets to decide how Starlink is used. It's the U.S. military. So he did have too much power, but you got to read the book to say to yourself, how did he get too much power? How come and there's a whole chapter on how did he make Starlink work so well and be so compact and be so hardened that only Starlink works, and Viasat and other companies can't do it.
I was just going to echo what Todd, I think part of what you were saying and asking Todd is he's known as the Tesla person, but when you read the book, he's really the SpaceX person. Like SpaceX is seemingly the dominant company, even though Tesla is obviously hugely important. And then the incredible things he's done at SpaceX, like we're just talking about, it really resonates. Could I ask you one thing that you talk about, Walter, that he constantly refers to is the algorithm. And I feel like when we were first exposed to something like the algorithm, it was the shale companies saying, do it again, try it again, take something out. What do we not need? Like that. But tell us about the algorithm and how important that is to his thinking.
It's really great to compare it to the unconventional extraction of gas and oil because it's an iterative process. And it was after both SpaceX and Tesla were having trouble again in 2017 and 2018. And he had to streamline manufacturing. And he noticed that all the robots were doing things too slowly. He'd walk the factory lines and they were trying to put a felt pad under the battery. And he'd say, why do we have it? And they'd say, well, there's a regulation or a rule. And they say, well, why do we have these little patches and these holes? I mean, he's down there in the micromanaging the details. They say, well, that was something that came from the legal department or this department. It was, and he finally said, tell me who actually makes these specifications, these rules. And tell me, let's go back to the underlying physics. Do we really need that? Do we need the plastic covers on the prongs? And so his first step in the algorithm became question every requirement, challenge every rule, challenge every regulation. Now, nowadays, if you work at a big company, you know that from the people dealing with the regulators to your legal department, there are layers and layers of people who say, no, probably shouldn't do that. No, stop, don't do that. And he said, we used to be a nation of risk takers, whether we came over on the Mayflower or came across the Rio Grande, we took risks. And he's addicted to risk. And so he would say, ignore the regulations, ignore the rule makers, ignore the legal department. Let's try it and see what works. Can be dangerous at times, but it ends up working. And then, as you said, as in the case with shale or other unconventional extractions, you delete every part of the process that's unnecessary. And only after you've gone through 4 steps of an algorithm of simplifying, deleting, speeding up the process, do you finally automate, because you've got to have a real feel for how each step works. And I'm glad you looked at it. You know, people are always saying, oh, tell me about his girlfriend or tell me about where he's tweeting something. His insights into manufacturing are the most valuable things in the book.
Well, that algorithm, I think it was sitting with Bill Thomas at EOG one time. He just said, look at what you do, see what's working, see what's not working, see what you can take out of it, and then do it again. So it just sounded remarkably similar. You mentioned risk. And there's a number of times in the book where, you know, at one point they don't have FAA clearance to launch a rocket, and Musk says, you know, go ahead. And at one point there's a crack in a piece of metal, and NASA would have scrubbed the mission, but Musk says, well, just trim it off, and I think we can go ahead and go. Like, there are multiple times where you have these moments where he's saying, let's take the risk. Maybe talk about that, because we have become seemingly, our world has gotten more risk averse in so many ways. And here's this guy.
Yeah, we become sclerotic because we're scared of taking risks. Peter Thiel told me, who was one of the co-founders of PayPal with Musk, he said, you know, most entrepreneurs try to figure out how to take risks. Elon relishes risk. He loves it. He runs towards it. There's my favorite picture in the book is a 40th birthday party where he's that Tallulah Riley, the actress who was then his wife, and he's standing against a target, his arms out, and he's got a pink balloon right in his crotch. And the deal is there's a knife thrower, and it's a blindfolded knife thrower who's trying to pop the balloons. Now, you look at that picture and say, there's no reason to there's no upside to this risk.
Right.
And there's a lot of downside, if you can imagine the pink balloon in your crotch. And yet he's just addicted to doing it. And he says, if you don't take too many risks, if you don't fail at least 20% of the time, you're not taking enough risk. The book ends. I mean, there are many things. Pulling out the servers on Christmas Eve from the Sacramento server center for Twitter. You know, shooting. But the book ends with the launch of Starship, the biggest rocket ever made, last April, or this April in South Texas. And he's there. I'm in the control room with him. They're doing the countdown. At one point, they get to T-minus 14, and there's a couple of leaks. And they look over at him, and he shakes his head. They abort the countdown at T-minus 14. 3 days later, they got it ready to go again. Once again, they get down to less than a minute. There's a couple of problems with some of there are 33 Raptor engines under the booster, and a couple of them seem to be having problems, according to the data they were getting. But Musk nods his head and says, try it, shoot it. And it goes up. It gets to space, goes up for 3 minutes. And then it explodes. And then there's debris in his wake. I remember my wife and my editor saying, well, what are you going to do with this? I said, it's a perfect metaphor. You know, he felt he had to do it. He's going to shoot Starship up again by the end of this year. And yeah, he does these astonishing things, gets the biggest rocket ever made into space, but then also leaves debris in his wake. Now, I don't think we should all take quite as many risks, but we've become a nation that's paralyzed at times because we don't take risks. And you know that better than anybody when it comes to the energy industry.
Yeah, and the book, the impression you get is someone who's always kind of living on the edge of risk and knows how to occasionally push it too far, and then learns it's not where you're watching where greater and greater risks are being taken and eventually it's going to end poorly. You don't feel that way. He somehow manages to live right on the edge of risk. Is that
He's got a good intuition. He has a good feel for physical properties. And so he can calculate risk pretty well. But his superpower is that even if somebody can calculate as well as he does, most people are afraid then to take the risk if there's a 5% chance of a failure.
He talks, it does come out in the book, the way he loves to blow off steam by gaming. And some of these games he plays are these kind of conquer the world war type games. So they're almost games which are simulations of life. And I think you comment in there, or he comments to you, you know, it's important to experience losing so you stop being afraid of it. He seems to use gaming not just for relaxation, but to hone his skills almost. Is that fair?
Yeah, I don't think gaming relaxes him. It energizes him. And there are a couple of rules he has, which is never rest. Always have to go to the next layer of the game. Always put all your chips back in. And the night he was considering making a hostile offer for Twitter, Elden Ring, a game that some of your younger colleagues would know, came out. It's on his phone. He said up to 5:30 in the morning, having to get to the very final level of the game. And then at 5:35, he sends out a message saying, I made an offer. That's when he buys Twitter, which is also in some ways taking a risk, putting all of his chips back in. And you say about the algorithm being in the book, there's a little fun section too called The Lessons of Polytopia, because his favorite game now is Polytopia, which, as you said, is a civilization, war, empire building game. And there's certain lessons from it, including that empathy is not your friend, and some counterintuitive lessons. But he plays life as if it's a game, as one of his girlfriends said.
You illustrate seems to have a really close relationship with his son, X. It's quite cute the way they hang out together, seemingly. And then you'll reference, and then the meeting ended and he took X home and it was like 2 a.m. But the kinship or affection with the children is an interesting side of him that you brought out.
Yeah, he always said that his biggest fear was being lonely and being alone ever since childhood. And the real only bonds that he has that are just intense are with his 10 surviving children. One died in infancy. And especially with X, the 3-year-old, who's almost, as Musk says, an emotional support child. He's always there. I think just this week was at the F1 races in Austin, I guess it was. It's really interesting. When they shot off Starship that I told you about in April, and it gets to the edge of space and then explodes, that night, I'm sitting in the back of sort of the area where there's a sort of food and a barbecue near the launch pad. There are a couple of boosters that are still upright on the edge of it. And there Elon is with X, the kid, wandering around. And he's there also with his mother, May Musk. And I watch X, and X is over at a fire pit, near where we were, throwing things in and putting his hand into the fire pit. You know me, I'm a father. I'm like, I got to get up and tell this kid not to do that, but I don't. And Musk says, when I was a kid, they said, don't play with matches. So I got a box of matches. I went behind the tree and I played with matches. And his mother, May, looked at X and looked at her son, Elon, and said, one generation of risk takers training the next.
Yeah, Walter, I thought one of the more amusing stories in there is when Gates went to to him for $100 million in philanthropy, and he basically says, "Okay, I'll talk to you." And then he says something to the effect of, "I hear you're $1 billion short, Tesla stock. Why are you?" And he goes through and says, and then he says something to the effect that, "I'll think about it." And then he calls him, I guess, a couple days or weeks later, and he says, "Are you still short Tesla stock?" "Yeah, I still am." And he's like, "Okay, well, hell with you."
I think he called him an asshole at this point, or an insane asshole, he tells me. It's interesting because, Gates, and you can be on both sides of this. I just tell the story because people can take Gates' side or they can take Musk. Musk feels, that $100 billion for climate change philanthropy that Bill wants. Musk feels if he keeps that money invested in Tesla, he's going to do more to help sustainable energy than giving it to some nonprofit. And in particular, he's outraged when he learns that Bill Gates is shorting Tesla stock. And Gates doesn't quite get that. I mean, Gates believes his philanthropy can do more. Musk wants to keep his money deployed in making new batteries and power walls and solar panels and cars. And so after Gates says, "No, I'm still shorting the stock," and Musk won't speak to him anymore, I went and I talked to Bill Gates because I'm a reporter. And I said, "Explain to me why you're shorting the Tesla stock." And Gates explains it to me. He says, "I've looked at the market for electric vehicles and the amount that will be sustained and how many could be made. And I've calculated that there's not as big of a market and it's going to not make as much money as Tesla stock holders think it will." So I said, "Yeah, I get it. But why are you shorting Tesla stock?" And I think Bill Gates thought I was a bit, of an idiot. So he tried to explain it to me again. And what I'm thinking, but I don't say it to Bill Gates, is you don't need to make more money. You don't need whatever you're going to make on shorting that stock. If shorting that stock is going to hurt Tesla, why are you doing it? Is it because you don't have enough money to buy yet another yacht? Is it? And I think that's a big difference where Musk is so mission driven that the notion, and, I don't think Gates, I think they disagree on whether short, and this is something y'all would understand better, does shorting a stock make the total available investment in a company a little bit shakier? Musk believes it does. And Musk just thinks it's not only hypocritical, but it's being an asshole to decide to short my stock if you care about the energy transition we need to go through.
Well, yeah, it was really funny because it illustrates maybe neither one of these guys are people, because if you're asking someone for something and, by the way, I'm shorting your stock, like that, it was a really funny story.
The other thing
I think they both have amazing intellectual processing power, amazing input output when it comes to data, but they're deficient more so than I think the three of us are when it comes to the input output receptors and transmitters for emotional human feelings, and whether somebody, shorting somebody's stock, whatever it may be.
Well, I think the other thing it said to me is that Elon is not afraid to go against the Silicon Valley billionaires club. He's willing to be an outsider. And it really kind of goes into my next subject is AI. Maybe talk about what he's doing in AI. What is his mission there?
Ever since he was a kid, as I said, that was his third mission, having read Asimov, the robot stories, in which it's feared that the robots could turn on us. And so early on, he talks to the people who run DeepMind, and they get sold to Google, which upsets him. So he and Sam Altman start OpenAI, and it's supposed to be a nonprofit with an open source algorithm to help make sure that AI is aligned with human values. Well, eventually OpenAI becomes not open. It becomes a proprietary and it becomes a for-profit. And Microsoft takes a huge, I think, $10 billion investment in it. And this infuriates Musk, who believes that Google and then Microsoft are going to control artificial intelligence. And so earlier this year, once again, I had been spending time with Musk. I go back home here to New Orleans, and he says, come back and see me. I got one more thing before you finish the book I want you to understand. So I go back to Austin, and he's in the backyard of Siobhan Zillis, who runs Neuralink, and also is the mother of two of his children. We're sitting by the pool, and he says, I'm going to start an AI company. I'm going to start a company called XAI, and I have to do it because we got to make sure that real world artificial intelligence is safe. And what he's doing is more than just these large language model generative AI, like the chat bots, ChatGPT, which deal in words. He wants it to also deal in real world things, such as self-driving cars and robots that can walk around the factory floor and figure out what's going wrong and find the right tool to fix it. And so the data feed that he has is like 1 billion frames a day from Tesla cameras, or the hive mind mentality from the Twitter feed. And so he is now dedicated to creating his own AI company that will do language model chatbotting. It'll also code for people, but eventually it will be tied in to real world visual data using Dojo chips and the Dojo supercomputer, as well as the NVIDIA GPUs. But Tesla's making its own Dojo processing that specializes in video data.
Hey, Walter, last question from me. You touched on earlier, I want to go back to Twitter for a minute. Of the things he's done, that's the only one that he's bought. Everything else he has either built or co-founded and got kicked out. And so what's interesting in the book, you go through how he is laying people off. But one of the things that struck me is he's really trying to remake the culture there to be like the culture at his other companies. How successful do you think he's been at that so far?
I thought it was insane.
It's a different kind of business.
I thought it was totally insane because I said to him, what are you going to do with Twitter? He said, well, it's a technology company and I'm going to help improve the engineering. And I'm thinking, it's not a technology company. Twitter's an advertising medium, and it depends on human emotions and gathering things. And I don't think he has the feel for that. And so I was, especially after the first couple of weeks when he fires 80% of the engineers, I'm thinking it's going to be destroyed. And yet it still putters along and actually starts putting in more things like full motion video. And there's a scene in the book called Christmas Capers, in which it's the day before Christmas Eve, December 23rd, and he's at a meeting at Twitter headquarters, and he realizes they've got 3 server farms, and he thinks they can do it with only 2, and he wants them out by the end of the year. So in Sacramento, he wants to get rid of the servers there. And all the old engineers at Twitter say, oh, you can't do that. It's going to hurt the product. And he says, I've thought about it. We can take the risk. And they said, well, it'll take us 6 months to get them out of the server center. We need to hire electricians and engineers and move them. And he said, no, you can do it in 6 weeks. And he gets really dark. He gets really mad. He goes into demon mode. And boom, he leaves, and he's just furious at these engineers who keep saying, we can't do it that fast. We can't do it. And they're flying, he and his 2 cousins and a couple of other people are on his plane, flying from San Francisco to Austin on Christmas Eve, December 24th. And one of the young cousins says to him, why don't we take out those servers ourselves? And Musk loves that type of risk-taking, impulsive thing. The plane makes a U-turn. It's over Nevada. He turns around and lands in Sacramento. And they go to the facility, scaring the hell out of the security people there, talk their way in. And he says, okay, we're going to start taking out these servers. They rented a U-Haul truck to take them out on Christmas Eve. And the person who's working at the server place says, well, you can't because you got to get engineers to remove this elevated floor and electric. And so Musk turns to his security guard, says, you got a pocket knife? And the guard hands him one. And Musk takes off one of the little vents in the floor panel, pulls it up, and then lifts up the floor panel himself and goes with a set of wire cutters from Home Depot and actually cuts the servers out. They move about a third of them that day. Now, I'm thinking that's going to destroy Twitter, but it's almost like the launch of Starship. It works for a while. It does really good. It stuns everybody at Twitter that, okay, maybe we can do this. But then later in January, when he's launching the DeSantis campaign, it doesn't work very well and it goes down a bit. And it's almost one of those mixed stories, like everything with Musk, is that, well, he proved you could do it, but he proved there were risks and there's some debris he's left in the wake. But every morning I'd fire up Twitter, or X as he calls it now, and it's still working. It's got full motion video. It's got more people on it than ever has. It's also a bit more toxic than I would like. But that's why you get with Elon Musk, you get the good, the bad, and the ugly.
So, Walter, you've had such a storied career in journalism, and you've so much of your career has been dedicated to telling the balanced story. Do you find the Twitter experiment to be uniquely interesting? Because in this in the outlines of it, Musk is talking a lot about free speech and why we can't have censorship. And that's something that everyone identifies with. But then when you see the struggles and what does that really mean? And you obviously don't want truly free speech. Like, did you find this part of it, given your career, to be kind of particularly interesting?
I remember being on the mezzanine in Austin when the new Tesla factory was just about to be opened, and he was buying Twitter. And there were 3 or 4 of us there. We were talking. He talked about the need for more free speech. Well, I've been around that track many times, and I believe in free speech. But I also believe that, hate speech or libelous speech or sometimes inflammatory or misinformation, it's a problem. And it's not an easy problem to solve, meaning you don't want the government telling you not to say things, obviously. But the notion of speech is a difficult thing to manage. And I asked a few questions. I said, okay, why is free speech so good? And I know why. I think it's good because it allows us individual autonomy. But he's saying, because it gets us closer to the truth. And then one of his friends, Ken Howery, saying, well, what if it doesn't? Sometimes it may spread misinformation. And I think you could see Musk realizing it's more complicated. But the guy who made him understand how more complicated it was is he's kind of a friend with Kanye West. I mean, in the way that celebrities that go to parties together can call themselves friends. And Kanye West has been kicked off of Twitter. And Musk says, okay, we're going to put him back on because we want more free speech. And then Kanye West posts some anti-Semitic things, including pictures of Elon getting hosed by Ari Emanuel with a Star of David. And Musk realizes this is really difficult. And so I think we're seeing, especially now with what's happening in the Middle East, but even before, that we all want to preserve free speech, but Musk is wrestling with what happens when you have a platform that depends on advertising, that is the news source for more people in the world than anything else. How do you allow free speech without amplifying speech that is dangerous or misinformation? And who gets to decide what's misinformation? I don't have the answer to those questions, even though I've worked for 30, 40 years in the information business. And I think we see Musk realizing each day the complexities of some of these questions.
Well, Walter, you're so great to spend some time with us.
I'm looking forward to coming back to Houston and being with you.
That was my next thing. We are so excited. We're going to have you in Houston November 12th. It's sponsored by the Brazos Bookstore, by Halliburton Labs, and by Veriten. We're so excited to have you. And
you and me are going to be there hosting it.
All right, it's at the Bayou Ballroom. We're really excited. Brazos Bookstore, Halliburton Labs, Veriten, and we get to have Walter Isaacson. Walter, thank you so much.
I'll see you on
Fantastic.
November 12th.
Yes, sir. Thanks, everybody. And thank you again, Walter.